The Forgotten Holocaust. How Nazi Germany systematically murdered 3 million Soviet prisoners of war. September 18, 1941. Stalag 352, Monsieur, Belorussia. Wehrmacht. Obergefreiter Hans Friedrich stood at the perimeter fence of the newly established prisoner of war camp, his hands trembling as he wrote words in his diary that would later be used as evidence at Nuremberg. They are dying faster than we can bury them. Yesterday, 320 men died in a single day. Today, it will be more. The camp commandant has stopped ordering grave details. He says to let them pile up. This is not war. This is extermination. Through the wire, Friedrich watched something that contradicted every assumption about prisoner treatment encoded in the Geneva Conventions, in military honor codes, in the basic rules of civilized warfare that had governed European conflict for centuries. 50,000 Soviet prisoners of war captured during the encirclement battles of summer 1941 were crammed into an open field with no shelter, no sanitation, insufficient water, and starvation rations deliberately calculated to cause death. They were not dying from wounds sustained in combat. They were not dying from epidemic disease sweeping through unsanitary conditions. They were dying because the Third Reich had made a conscious policy decision that Soviet prisoners of war would be systematically murdered through calculated neglect, deliberate starvation, mass execution, and industrial-scale killing that would ultimately claim over 3 million lives. This was impossible to reconcile with German military tradition. The Wehrmacht prided itself on following international law regarding prisoners. British and American POWs held in German camps experienced harsh conditions but survived at rates exceeding 95%. Soviet prisoners died at rates exceeding 57%. The mathematics of this genocide were being written not in gas chambers, not in mass shooting pits, but in thousands of camps where Soviet soldiers were being deliberately exterminated through methods designed to appear as natural consequences of war, rather than premeditated murder. The systematic destruction had begun the moment German forces crossed the Soviet border on June 22, 1941, and it would become the single largest mass murder of prisoners of war in recorded history. The magnitude of the crime. The statistics defied human comprehension through their sheer scale. Between June 1941 and May 1945, German forces captured approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers. Of these, 3.3 million died in German captivity, a death rate of 57.8%. By comparison, of the 232,000 British and American prisoners held by Germany, approximately 3.5% died. The differential mortality rate revealed that Soviet prisoners were experiencing treatment fundamentally different from other POWs, treatment that constituted systematic mass murder rather than harsh but survivable captivity. The killing occurred across German-occupied territory and within the Reich itself. Wehrmacht-administered stalags, base camps, dulags, transit camps, and oflags, officer camps, held millions of Soviet prisoners in conditions deliberately designed to cause mass death. Additional hundreds of thousands of Soviet POWs were transferred to SS concentration camps, where they became test subjects for Zyklon B gas at Auschwitz. Slave laborers worked to death at Mauthausen, and execution victims at Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald. The timeline of death revealed systematic intent. In the first 8 months of the German-Soviet War, between June 1941 and February 1942, approximately 2 million Soviet prisoners died. This represented 60% of all Soviet POW deaths during the entire war, compressed into a period when Germany still maintained military superiority and logistical capacity to provide adequate care. The deaths were not unfortunate byproducts of military chaos, but deliberate implementation of Nazi racial ideology that classified Slavic peoples as Untermenschen, subhumans, unworthy of protection under international law. The roots of this genocide lay not in military necessity, but in ideological calculation formulated months before the invasion began. March 30th, 1941. The Reich Chancellery, Berlin. Adolf Hitler addressed Wehrmacht senior commanders gathered to receive operational orders for Operation Barbarossa, the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. His instructions, recorded in multiple sources including the diary of General Franz Halder and post-war testimony, outlined a war fundamentally different from previous German campaigns. The coming war against Soviet Russia cannot be fought in knightly fashion. The struggle is one of ideologies and racial differences and will have to be waged with unprecedented, unmerciful, and unrelenting hardness. Commissars and GPU men are criminals and must be dealt with as such. German soldiers guilty of breaking international law will be excused. Russia has not participated in the Hague Convention and therefore has no rights under it. This declaration, later formalized as the Commissar Order and related directives, established legal framework for treating Soviet prisoners outside international law. Wehrmacht Judge Advocate General argued these orders violated Hague Conventions that Germany had signed. Hitler overruled all objections, declaring that the existential nature of the conflict with Bolshevism superseded conventional legal constraints. The stage was set for the largest prisoner of war massacre in modern history. Thematic Analysis, Chapter 1. The Legal Fiction. How Germany justified the unjustifiable, the Nazi regime constructed elaborate legal justification for treating Soviet POWs outside international humanitarian law. The argument centered on Soviet Union's non-ratification of the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. While the Soviet Union had signed the 1907 Hague Convention and offered in 1941 to adhere to Geneva Convention provisions on reciprocal basis, Germany rejected this offer and claimed Soviet non-signature justified German non-compliance. This legal argument was transparently dishonest. International law established that humanitarian treatment of prisoners constituted customary international law, binding regardless of treaty signature. Moreover, Germany maintained Geneva Convention compliance with British, American, and other Western Allied prisoners whose nations had signed the treaty, demonstrating German capacity to provide adequate treatment when politically motivated to do so. Dr. Otto Thierack, Reich Minister of Justice, articulated the regime's position in a September 1942 memorandum. The German people's struggle for existence justifies treatment of hostile prisoners according to principles different from those governing relations with civilized nations. Bolshevist soldiers have forfeited all rights to treatment as honorable combatants through their commissars' activities and partisan warfare methods. The Reich is therefore legally entitled to employ all measures necessary to eliminate the danger these prisoners represent. This reasoning inverted causality. Soviet partisan warfare and harsh treatment of German prisoners occurred in response to German atrocities, not before them. The Nazi regime used consequences of their own criminal policies as retroactive justification for those policies, a circular logic that would be comprehensively rejected at Nuremberg. Wehrmacht officers who objected to prisoner mistreatment were overruled by explicit orders from the High Command. Colonel Henning von Treschow, later a resistance member executed after the July 1944 plot against Hitler, described the legal situation in correspondence with fellow officers. "We are being ordered to commit war crimes under cover of military necessity. The order to execute commissars violates every principle of military honor and international law. We are told Soviet prisoners have no rights because Russia didn't sign Geneva Convention. This is sophistry. The Hague Convention binds us regardless. We are becoming criminals in uniform. The systematic nature of the legal fiction became clear through documentation captured after the war. OKW, Wehrmacht High Command, issued detailed directives specifying reduced rations for Soviet prisoners. authorization for guards to shoot prisoners who lagged during marches, prohibition of medical care beyond minimal emergency treatment, and permission to use Soviet POWs for dangerous labor forbidden under Geneva Convention for other prisoners. These orders were not isolated criminal initiatives by rogue commanders, but systematic policy directed from the highest levels of German military and political leadership. Chapter 2. The Death Marches. Murder through forced movement. The killing of Soviet prisoners began not in camps, but during capture and transport. Wehrmacht doctrine for handling massive prisoner hauls proved catastrophically inadequate when applied to the unprecedented numbers captured during initial Barbarossa operations. In the first 4 weeks of invasion, German forces captured approximately 600,000 Soviet soldiers. By September 1941, this number exceeded 2 million. The German military logistics system had no capacity to feed, house, or transport prisoners at this scale. The Wehrmacht's solution was to march prisoners hundreds of kilometers to rear area camps without adequate food, water, or rest. These death marches killed hundreds of thousands through exhaustion, dehydration, starvation, and execution of those who couldn't maintain pace. Lieutenant Hubert Gschöpf, whose diary was captured by Soviet forces in 1944, described a march from Minsk to Bobruisk in July 1941. "We are marching approximately 40,000 prisoners east. They receive no food from us. They must forage or starve. Water is available only when we cross streams. The column stretches for kilometers. Those who fall behind are shot by rear guards. Yesterday we left approximately 600 bodies along the route. Today it will be more. The heat is oppressive. Many prisoners are wounded and can barely walk. We show no mercy." The mathematical calculation was explicit. German quartermasters determined that feeding prisoners during transport would require diverting supplies from combat operations. The decision was made to accept massive prisoner mortality rather than strain logistics. This represented deliberate choice, not unavoidable circumstance. German forces advancing into Soviet territory captured enormous food stocks in occupied areas. These supplies were requisitioned for German use or destroyed to deny them to Soviet forces. Feeding prisoners from these stocks would have been possible but was prohibited by policy. Private Ivan Konovalov, who survived a death march from Kiev to Uman in September 1941, testified at post-war investigations. "We marched for 9 days. We received no food during the entire march. Water was given twice. Dirty stream water we fought over like animals. Men died continuously. Those who fell were shot immediately. Those who stepped out of column to defecate were shot. We marched past German supply depots loaded with food. They guarded these supplies while we starved to death walking past them. This was not deprivation caused by war. This was murder by policy." The death toll from marches was staggering. Post-war analysis of German records, cross-referenced with Soviet repatriation data and witness testimony, estimated that approximately 500,000 Soviet prisoners died during forced marches before ever reaching camps. This represented nearly 10% of total Soviet POW deaths, compressed into march periods lasting days or weeks. The concentration of death revealed systematic intent. Prisoners were being eliminated through calculated neglect and violence rather than transported to detention. Chapter 3. The Starvation Camps. Industrial Scale. Murder through hunger. The camps established to house Soviet prisoners constituted open-air death factories where starvation was employed as method of mass murder. Unlike concentration camps, with gas chambers and crematoria, these facilities killed through systematic deprivation that German authorities could characterize as unfortunate rather than criminal. Stalag 352 at Masyr, Belorussia, exemplified the system. Established in July 1941 to hold 10,000 prisoners, by September, the camp contained over 100,000 Soviet POWs. The facility consisted of open fields surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Prisoners had no barracks, no shelter beyond holes they dug in earth, no sanitation beyond open latrines, and no medical care. Daily rations consisted of watery soup, occasional bread, and water. The caloric content averaged 700 calories daily, approximately one-third of minimum required for survival. The ration level was not accidental. German military medical officers calculated that humans required approximately 2,100 calories daily for basic survival without work. The prescribed Soviet POW ration was explicitly designed to cause death within weeks. OKW Directive of September 21, 1941, specified rations for Soviet prisoners at levels German nutritional experts knew were fatal. This constituted premeditated murder through bureaucratic means. Dr. Ernst Mansfeld, Wehrmacht medical officer assigned to inspect prison camps in Ukraine, reported in November 1941. The prisoner ration is scientifically calculated to cause death. Men receiving this diet will exhaust body fat reserves within 3 weeks and begin consuming muscle tissue. Within 6 to 8 weeks, organ failure commences. Death follows inevitably. The ration cannot sustain life. The prisoners are being systematically starved to death by policy, not circumstance. I have protested through channels. My protests are ignored. The physical progression of starvation among prisoners followed predictable medical patterns. Private Mikhail Devyatayev, who survived captivity and later escaped from Peenemünde rocket facility, described the process. The first week, hunger was painful but bearable. The second week, weakness set in. Men could not stand without effort. The third week, people began dying. You could see death in their faces days before it came. The hollow eyes, the gray skin, the way they stopped moving. After 4 weeks, half the men in my section were dead. After 6 weeks, 3/4 were gone. Those of us who survived did so by eating grass, insects, tree bark, anything we could find. Some ate the dead. The Germans watched and did nothing. The death rate at starvation camps peaked during winter 1941-1942. At Stalag 352, mortality reached 500 prisoners daily by December 1941, over 15,000 deaths monthly in a single camp. Across the entire camp system, approximately 140,000 Soviet prisoners died monthly during the winter peak. German authorities made no attempt to reduce death rates through increased rations, medical care, or shelter. Orders specified that dead prisoners should be stripped of remaining clothing and possessions before burial or cremation, with materials returned to German logistics system. Even in death, Soviet prisoners were treated as resource to be exploited rather than humans deserving dignity. Chapter 4. The Commissar Order, Legalizing Murder. The Commissar Order, formerly titled Guidelines for the Treatment of Political Commissars, issued June 6, 1941, represented explicit authorization for mass murder of specific categories of Soviet prisoners. The order directed that captured Red Army political commissars, identified by distinctive insignia, were to be segregated from other prisoners and liquidated immediately without trial or judicial process. The rationale invoked ideological rather than military necessity. Commissars represented Bolshevik political control over military forces and were characterized as originators of barbaric Asiatic fighting methods. Their elimination was framed as preventative measure against partisan warfare and maintenance of discipline among remaining prisoners. In reality, the order established precedent for treating categories of Soviet prisoners as targets for execution rather than detention. Implementation varied by unit, but resulted in systematic mass killing. Wehrmacht and SS Einsatzgruppen, death squads, screened prisoners for commissars, Communist Party members, Jews, and intellectuals. Those identified were taken from camps and executed, typically by shooting. The numbers were substantial. Post-war analysis estimated 140,000 to 580,000 Soviet prisoners were executed under Commissar Order provisions in 1941 alone. Lieutenant Albert Hartl, attached to Einsatzgruppe B operating in Belorussia, recorded the procedure in testimony given to Soviet investigators in 1944. We received prisoner transports from Wehrmacht camps. We screened for commissars, Jews, and Communist Party members through document examination and interrogation. Those identified were taken to execution sites, typically forest clearings or anti-tank ditches, and shot. The Wehrmacht wanted this done away from camps to avoid demoralizing effect on remaining prisoners. We conducted these operations 3 to 4 times weekly. Each action liquidated 200 to 800 prisoners. The Wehrmacht provided transportation and logistical support. They knew exactly what was happening. Wehrmacht complicity in Commissar Order execution destroyed the myth of clean Wehrmacht that post-war German military memoirs attempted to establish. While SS units conducted many executions, Wehrmacht intelligence officers performed screening, Wehrmacht guards delivered prisoners to execution sites, and Wehrmacht administrative staff documented deaths. The murder of Commissar category prisoners was joint Wehrmacht SS operation, not rogue SS action. Senior Wehrmacht commanders objected to the Commissar Order, but on practical rather than moral grounds. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock argued the order would stiffen Soviet resistance by eliminating surrender incentive. General Franz Halder noted that commissar executions violated military honor and would be used by Soviet propaganda to justify harsh treatment of German prisoners. These practical objections were overruled by Hitler, who insisted ideological struggle with Bolshevism required methods outside conventional military law. The Commissar Order was formally rescinded in May 1942. Not from moral reconsideration, but because Wehrmacht field commanders reported it strengthened Soviet resistance by proving German propaganda about German intentions accurate. Soviet soldiers fought more desperately when they understood surrender meant execution. German military pragmatism, not humanitarian concern, ended the policy, but by then hundreds of thousands had been murdered under its provisions. Chapter 5. The Concentration Camp Connection, Soviet POWs as Test Subjects, the Intersection of Wehrmacht. POW camps and SS concentration camp system revealed the integration of Soviet prisoner murder into broader Nazi extermination apparatus. Beginning in fall 1941, tens of thousands of Soviet POWs were transferred from Wehrmacht camps to SS concentration camps for special treatment. A euphemism for execution. Auschwitz concentration camp became testing ground for Zyklon B gas using Soviet prisoners as subjects. In September 1941, SS authorities at Auschwitz conducted experimental gassings in Block 11 punishment cells and crematorium pool using approximately 600 Soviet POWs and 250 Polish prisoners. The success of these tests, success measured by efficiency of killing, led to construction of dedicated gas chambers that would become central to Holocaust implementation. Rudolf Höss, Auschwitz commandant, described the first Soviet POW gassing in testimony at Nuremberg. In the fall of 1941, the Gestapo sent approximately 900 Russian prisoners of war to Auschwitz for liquidation. We were ordered to determine most efficient method of execution. Shooting was considered too public and psychologically damaging to execution squads. We experimented with Zyklon B pesticide in sealed rooms. The first test used Soviet POWs. They died within minutes. The method was deemed suitable for larger-scale operations. The murdered Soviet prisoners were the test cases for methods later applied to Jewish deportees. Soviet POWs at Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, and other camps experienced conditions even worse than general concentration camp population. They were designated Sonderkommandos, special action prisoners, subject to deliberate extermination through impossible labor, minimal rations, medical experimentation, and outright execution. At Mauthausen Quarry, Soviet POWs were forced to carry heavy stones up the stairs of death, 186 steps from quarry floor to camp level. Guards shot prisoners who fell or moved too slowly. This served no practical purpose beyond murder, through exhaustion. SS records from Mauthausen documented death rates among Soviet POWs exceeding 90% within 6 months of arrival. Political prisoner Stanisław Grzesiuk, Polish resistance member imprisoned at Sachsenhausen, witnessed treatment of Soviet POWs. The Russian prisoners were treated worse than any group in camp. They received smallest rations, hardest labor assignments, no medical care, and frequent beatings. SS guards would shoot them for minor infractions that would earn other prisoners brief punishment. I watched SS men force Russian prisoners to stand at attention in freezing weather for hours as punishment for camp infractions they had not committed. Men died standing up, frozen to death. This happened regularly. The SS viewed Russian prisoners as disposable labor, worked them until they died, then replaced them with fresh transports. Chapter 6. The Myth of Reciprocity. False Justifications for Murder, Nazi Propaganda and Post-War German Memoirs, constructed narrative that harsh treatment of Soviet prisoners represented response to Soviet mistreatment of German POWs. This claim constituted historical inversion, chronologically false and morally bankrupt attempt to justify war crimes through consequences those crimes produced. The timeline demolished the reciprocity argument. Mass death of Soviet prisoners began immediately after Operation Barbarossa, commenced in June 1941. German forces captured approximately 300,000 Soviet prisoners in first 2 weeks of invasion. Death rates among these prisoners exceeded 30% before Soviet forces had captured significant numbers of German prisoners. The starvation camps, death marches, and commissar order executions were implemented as deliberate policy from invasion's start, not as retaliation for Soviet actions. Soviet treatment of German prisoners was harsh, particularly in first years of war, with death rates among German POWs in Soviet captivity reaching approximately 35%. Terrible, but substantially lower than 58% German death rate for Soviet prisoners. Moreover, evidence indicated Soviet prisoner mortality resulted primarily from genuine supply shortages and logistics breakdown caused by German invasion's devastation of Soviet infrastructure, not from systematic extermination policy comparable to German treatment of Soviet POWs. The contrast became clear through comparative analysis. British and American prisoners in German camps experienced death rates under 4%. This demonstrated German capacity to provide adequate care when motivated to do so. The differential death rate between Western and Soviet prisoners revealed that Soviet prisoner mortality resulted from deliberate policy, not resource scarcity. Dr. Alfred Rosenberg, Reich Minister for Occupied Eastern Territories, articulated this reality in February 1942 memorandum criticizing POW policy. The death rate among Soviet prisoners represents unprecedented catastrophe and eliminates labor force we desperately need. Of 3.6 million Soviet prisoners, only several 100,000 remain fit for work. The remainder have died or are dying. This situation results not from necessity, but from policy failures and ideological dogmatism. We have destroyed resources we could have exploited through moderate treatment. Rosenberg's criticism focused on wasted labor potential, not humanitarian concern, but his admission that prisoner deaths resulted from policy rather than necessity destroyed the reciprocity justification. German authorities deliberately chose mass death over prisoner utilization, even when utilization would have served German military interests. Chapter 7. The Labor Exploitation. Death through Industrial Slavery. As German labor shortages intensified from 1942 onward, Nazi policy toward surviving Soviet POWs shifted from immediate extermination to death through labor exploitation. Prisoners who survived initial captivity, months were increasingly transferred to forced labor programs where they were worked to death under conditions violating every provision of international humanitarian law. Soviet POWs were assigned to hardest, most dangerous work: mining, construction, munitions production, with minimal safety equipment, grossly inadequate food, and no medical care. The policy explicitly calculated prisoner mortality as acceptable cost of labor extraction. Workers who became too weak to work were returned to camps to die or, increasingly from 1943 onward, executed as unproductive mouth to feed. Organization Todt, the Reich's civil and military engineering group, employed hundreds of thousands of Soviet POWs in construction projects across occupied Europe. Workers built Atlantic Wall fortifications, underground factories, military airfields, and infrastructure. The death rate among these workers exceeded 50% annually. They were literally worked to death, then replaced from fresh prisoner transports. Engineer Franz Xaver Dorsch, Organization Todt deputy, described labor practices in post-war testimony. The Russians were considered expendable labor. We calculated project costs assuming 100% labor turnover annually through death or disability. This was built into planning. Workers received starvation rations, worked 12 to 16-hour days, slept in unheated barracks, and received no medical care. When workers became too weak to work, they were sent back to camps. We knew they would die. That was acceptable under the system. We viewed Soviet POWs as self-replacing machinery. Work until broken, then replace. The mining industry consumed Soviet POW labor with particular ruthlessness. Coal mines, iron ore mines, and salt mines throughout the Reich and occupied territories used Soviet prisoners for underground work considered too dangerous for German workers. Minimal safety precautions, inadequate ventilation, and exhausted workers created accident rates that killed thousands. Private Konstantin Sergeychik, who survived forced labor in Ruhr coal mines, described conditions. We worked 10 hours daily underground in conditions that violated every safety rule. Ventilation was inadequate. We breathed coal dust constantly. Support timbers were insufficient. Collapses occurred weekly. We had minimal lighting, inadequate tools, and were beaten if production fell below quotas that were physically impossible to meet. Men died daily from accidents, exhaustion, respiratory failure. The German supervisors called us Russian pigs and told us we should be grateful to serve the Reich before we died. Those who became too sick to work were taken away. We never saw them again. The armaments industry employed Soviet POWs in munitions factories, directly violating Geneva Convention prohibition against forcing prisoners to produce military materials. Soviet workers manufactured artillery shells, bullets, bombs, and vehicle components used against their own forces. Those who resisted or sabotaged production were executed as examples to others. Chapter 8. The Medical Experiments. Science in service of murder Soviet POWs became subjects of Nazi medical experiments that combined pseudo-scientific inquiry with systematic murder. At concentration camps and Wehrmacht medical facilities, Soviet prisoners were subjected to procedures designed to test human endurance limits, evaluate disease progression, and develop military medical capabilities, all without consent and with complete disregard for subject survival. Dr. Sigmund Rasche conducted hypothermia experiments at Dachau using Soviet POWs and concentration camp prisoners. Subjects were immersed in ice water or left naked in freezing temperatures to determine how long German pilots downed in North Atlantic could survive. The experiments killed dozens of subjects through exposure, with survivors often suffering permanent injury. Rascher's experimental reports, captured after war, described procedures with clinical detachment masking profound criminality. Subject was immersed in water temperature 2.7 degrees Celsius. Core body temperature monitored via rectal thermometer. Subject remained conscious for 53 minutes before losing consciousness. Death occurred after 87 minutes of immersion. Rewarming attempts were unsuccessful. This procedure was repeated with 15 subjects to establish baseline survival duration. Results confirmed that survival beyond 90 minutes in water below 4 degrees Celsius is unlikely without immediate intervention. At Sachsenhausen, Dr. Werner Haider conducted pharmaceutical experiments on Soviet POWs to test effects of various drugs and chemical agents. Subjects were administered experimental medications, poison compounds, and disease agents to observe effects. Those who survived immediate effects of testing were typically executed to prevent testimony about procedures. Josef Mengele, later notorious for Auschwitz experiments, conducted research on Soviet POWs in 1942-1943 period, including studies on infectious disease transmission and trauma response. Subjects were deliberately infected with typhus, tuberculosis, and other diseases to observe disease progression without treatment. The research served no legitimate medical purpose. Treatment was never intended, making these murder studies rather than medical experiments. The malaria experiments at Dachau used hundreds of Soviet POWs as subjects. Prisoners were infected with malaria strains to test various treatment approaches. Control groups received no treatment, allowing researchers to observe untreated disease progression. Survival rate among experimental subjects was approximately 30%. The research killed more subjects than it potentially benefited through knowledge gained. Medical experimentation on prisoners violated Nuremberg Code, principles established at post-war trials. Voluntary consent of subject is absolutely essential. Experiment must yield results for good of society. Unnecessary suffering should be avoided. Nazi medical experiments on Soviet POWs violated every principle, constituting murder under guise of science. Chapter 9. The Child Prisoners. The youngest victims. Among the least known aspects of Soviet POW murder was capture and killing of child soldiers and military-age youth. The Red Army, in desperate circumstances of 1941-1942, mobilized teenagers as young as 15 into military service. When captured, these child soldiers received no special consideration. They were processed as regular POWs and subjected to same starvation, disease, and execution as adult prisoners. Stalag 337 at Baranovichi held several thousand juvenile prisoners by late 1941. Witnesses described boys aged 14 to 17 dying from starvation and disease at rates exceeding adult prisoners. Their smaller body mass meant they succumbed to starvation more rapidly. The camp administration provided no additional rations or special care for juvenile prisoners. Private Vladimir Sokolov, age 16 when captured in July 1941, testified after repatriation. I was in prisoner column with many boys my age or younger. We received same treatment as adult soldiers. No food during march, beatings if we fell behind, no shelter at camp. The younger boys died fastest. They had no strength reserves to survive on starvation rations. Within 3 weeks, most boys under 16 in my section were dead. The Germans showed no mercy for age. They called us young Bolsheviks who would grow into enemies and said it was better we died now. The killing of child prisoners particularly demonstrated the genocidal rather than military nature of Soviet POW treatment. International law and basic human decency demanded special protection for juvenile combatants. Nazi authorities extended no such protection, implementing age-blind murder policy that killed children and adults with equal systematic efficiency. Chapter 10. The Survival Strategies. How some endured the unendurable. The 43% of Soviet prisoners who survived captivity did so through combination of luck, collaboration, and extreme adaptation to brutal conditions. Survival strategies ranged from heroic resistance to morally compromising cooperation with captors. Understanding how prisoners survived reveals both human resilience and the impossible moral choices imposed by genocidal captivity. The most common survival strategy involved volunteering for work details that provided additional food. Prisoners who worked in German factories, farms, or construction projects often received modestly better rations than those in base camps. Still inadequate, but sufficient to prevent starvation death. This collaboration with German war economy troubled survivors morally, but the alternative was certain death. Private Nikolai Obrinba, who survived captivity working in German coal mine, described the moral calculation. I volunteered for mining work because workers received additional food ration. I knew I would be producing coal that powered German war machine. I knew this made me collaborator, but the alternative was staying in camp and dying within weeks. Every man faced this choice: collaborate to survive or maintain moral purity and die. Most chose survival. We told ourselves that living to return home and testify about German crimes justified the compromise. Some of us believed that. Some just wanted to live. Some prisoners survived through privileged positions as camp functionaries, administrators, or informers. These positions provided better food, shelter, and relative safety from violence. The moral cost was high. Functionary prisoners often had to enforce German orders against fellow prisoners, report escape attempts, or identify commissars and Jews for execution. Post-war Soviet society treated these survivors as collaborators and traitors, sending many to gulag camps after repatriation. Other prisoners survived through escape. Approximately 500,000 Soviet POWs attempted escape during captivity, with perhaps 100,000 succeeding in reaching Soviet lines or joining partisan units. Escape was extraordinarily dangerous. Recaptured escapees were typically executed, and German reprisal policy often meant that 10 to 50 prisoners were shot for each successful escape. Yet desperation drove continuous escape attempts throughout the war. Lieutenant Mikhail Devyatayev's escape from Peenemünde in February 1945 represented one of most dramatic survival stories. Devyatayev, a Soviet Air Force pilot, organized escape of 10 prisoners by hijacking a German He-111 bomber and flying it back to Soviet lines. His survival and eventual recognition as hero of the Soviet Union was exceptional. Most escape attempts ended in death. The smallest group of survivors endured through simple physiological resilience. Some individuals possessed constitutions that allowed survival on starvation rations that killed others. Medical studies of camp survivors identified genetic and physiological factors that improved survival probability, but these advantages were marginal. Luck and circumstance mattered more than individual characteristics. Chapter 11. The Liberation and After. Discovery and Denial. Soviet forces, liberating occupied territories, discovered the camps and their survivors beginning in late 1943. The physical evidence of mass murder was overwhelming. Mass graves containing hundreds of thousands of bodies, emaciated survivors weighing 35-40 kilograms, documentary evidence of deliberate starvation policy, witness testimony from both prisoners and guards. Marshal Georgy Zhukov described liberating a camp near Lublin in July 1944. The survivors were barely human in appearance, skeletal figures in rags, many too weak to stand. The dead were piled like cordwood awaiting burial. The camp commander had fled, but documentation remained showing deliberate policy to minimize rations below survival levels. This was not the result of war's hardships, but systematic extermination. Thousands had died here over 2 years. The physical evidence made German claims of proper treatment obvious lies. Liberated Soviet POWs faced tragic irony. Rather than being welcomed as returned heroes, they were treated with suspicion and often subjected to harsh interrogation by NKVD security services. Stalin's regime assumed that surrender constituted cowardice or treason. Many repatriated POWs were sent to Gulag camps for years of imprisonment. This brutal treatment meant liberation from German camps, led directly to Soviet imprisonment for hundreds of thousands of survivors. The psychological impact on survivors proved devastating. Private Pyotr Braiko, liberated in 1945 and immediately imprisoned in Soviet labor camp, described the double trauma. We survived German captivity believing we would return as heroes who had endured the unendurable. Instead, we were treated as traitors. The Soviet state we fought to defend imprisoned us for the crime of surviving enemy captivity. This was crushing betrayal. Many survivors wished they had died in German camps rather than face Soviet punishment for surviving. The psychological damage from Soviet treatment rivaled the physical damage from German captivity. Western Allied forces, liberating camps in Germany from late 1944 onward, documented Soviet POW treatment through photographs, film, and testimony. The evidence collected formed crucial component of Nuremberg prosecution. However, the scale of Soviet POW deaths received less attention than Holocaust crimes against Jews, partially because Soviet Union's own harsh treatment of repatriated prisoners complicated the narrative, and partially because Cold War politics discouraged emphasizing Soviet victimization that might generate sympathy for Soviet Union. Chapter 12. The Nuremberg Reckoning, Justice Incomplete. The Nuremberg trials addressed Soviet POW murder as war crime and crime against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming. Captured German documents explicitly outlined policies to starve and work prisoners to death. Witness testimony from both victims and perpetrators confirmed systematic implementation. Physical evidence from mass graves provided irrefutable proof of scale. The December 1945 indictment charged defendants with murder and ill-treatment of prisoners of war in violation of Article 46 of Hague Convention of 1907, Articles 2, 3, and 4 of Geneva Convention of 1929, and general principles of criminal law as derived from domestic laws of all civilized nations. The prosecution presented captured orders, testimony from Wehrmacht and SS personnel, survivor testimony, and photographic evidence. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of OKW, attempted to justify POW policy by claiming Soviet Union's non-ratification of Geneva Convention relieved Germany of obligations. The tribunal rejected this argument, establishing that customary international law required humane treatment regardless of treaty ratification. Keitel was convicted on multiple counts including crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was executed October 16, 1946. General Alfred Jodl, chief of Wehrmacht Operations Staff, claimed ignorance of camp conditions and argued that any abuses resulted from logistics breakdown rather than systematic policy. The prosecution demolished this defense through captured documents bearing Jodl's signature, authorizing reduced rations and harsh treatment measures. Jodl was convicted and executed October 16, 1946. However, the Nuremberg process had significant limitations. Many Wehrmacht officers responsible for camp operations escaped prosecution through death, suicide, or disappearance. Lower-level personnel who implemented murder policies often received light sentences or avoided prosecution entirely. The vast majority of guards, administrators, and others who participated in Soviet POW murder were never held accountable. The historical impact of Nuremberg's treatment of Soviet POW crimes was mixed. While the trials established legal precedent that mistreatment of prisoners constitutes war crimes regardless of victims' nationality or legal status, The subsequent focus on Holocaust crimes partially overshadowed Soviet POW murder in popular memory. For decades, the 3 million Soviet prisoners murdered received less historical attention than smaller-scale but more systematically documented Holocaust crimes. The mathematics of genocide, made bureaucratic December 1944. Stalag 326, Senne, Germany. The camp stood nearly empty now, its surviving prisoners transferred to labor details or evacuated westward as Soviet forces approached from east. Wehrmacht Obergefreiter Hans Friedrich, the same soldier who had witnessed mass death at Stalag 352 in September 1941, stood in camp administration office destroying records as per evacuation orders. Documents detailed 3 years of systematic murder. Daily ration allocations deliberately calculated below survival levels, monthly mortality statistics tracking deaths like production quotas, transfer orders, sending prisoners to concentration camps for execution, mass grave locations, and body counts. Friedrich had watched approximately 300,000 Soviet prisoners pass through Stalag 326 during his posting. Of these, roughly 60,000 died in camp or shortly after transfer to labor details. The mathematics of murder had been reduced to bureaucratic routine. Death rates tracked in ledgers, corpse disposal documented with Germanic precision, the systematic extinction of human beings processed as administrative function. But the evidence survived attempts at destruction. Allied forces would capture millions of pages of German documents detailing the systematic murder of Soviet POWs. The physical evidence, mass graves, emaciated survivors, abandoned camps, would prove beyond doubt that Nazi Germany had perpetrated genocide against Soviet prisoners of war through calculated starvation, deliberate exposure, forced labor, and mass execution. The victory of evidence over erasure was sealed not in military triumph, but in documentation. Germany's own meticulous record-keeping provided proof of crimes the regime attempted to deny. The Reich that claimed Soviet prisoners died from unfortunate circumstances of war had documented those deaths with precision that revealed systematic intent. The bureaucratic efficiency that enabled industrial-scale murder ultimately enabled comprehensive prosecution. The enduring legacy of this forgotten genocide transformed international humanitarian law and military justice. The Nuremberg trials established that mistreatment of prisoners of war constitutes crime against humanity regardless of victims' nationality, legal status, or captors' political ideology. The precedent that following orders provides no defense against war crimes originated partly from prosecutions of personnel involved in Soviet POW murder. The principle that systematic starvation constitutes murder rather than neglect was established through evidence from Soviet POW camps. But the human cost remained the darkest aspect of the crime. The 3.3 million Soviet soldiers who died in German captivity, men who had fought for their nation, who surrendered believing they would receive treatment mandated by international law, who died not from combat wounds, but from deliberate murder through starvation, disease, exposure, and execution. These men had families who waited for return that never came, children who grew up without fathers, wives who became widows without ever learning how their husbands died. The contrast between Western and Soviet prisoner mortality rates, 3.5% versus 57.8%, provided mathematical proof that Nazi Germany implemented racially determined genocide against Slavic peoples that paralleled the more widely remembered Holocaust against Jews. The differential treatment revealed that Nazi ideology classified humans into hierarchies deserving vastly different standards of care, with Slavs categorized as Untermenschen unworthy of protection under civilized norms. Hans Friedrich, destroying records in December 1944, understood the moral weight of his participation. We knew what we were doing. We watched men die by thousands from deliberate starvation while we had access to food that could have saved them. We followed orders that we knew violated every principle of military honor and human decency. We told ourselves that Russians were different, that they didn't feel pain the same way, that Soviet treatment of German prisoners justified our actions. These were lies we told to escape moral responsibility for murder we committed daily through bureaucratic process. The story of how Nazi Germany systematically murdered 3 million Soviet prisoners of war is ultimately a story of industrialized genocide. Death made routine through bureaucratic systems, murder executed through memorandums and administrative orders. The extinction of human beings reduced to logistics problem solved through calculated starvation and systematic violence. It proves that the greatest atrocities are often committed not through passionate hatred, but through bureaucratic indifference, not through spontaneous violence, but through systematic policy. Not by monsters, but by ordinary men who convince themselves that orders justify crimes and ideology excuses murder. The Soviet prisoners who died in German camps were not abstractions or statistics, but individuals, men with names, families, hopes, fears, and rights under international law that were systematically violated by a regime that classified them as subhuman and expendable. They died not from military necessity, but from ideological calculation that placed racial hierarchy above human dignity and political goals above moral constraints. From June 1941, when the first captured Soviet soldiers were deliberately starved to death, to May 1945, when the last survivors were liberated, Nazi Germany proved that modern states possess capacity for systematic murder at industrial scale when unconstrained by moral considerations or humanitarian law. The 3.3 million Soviet prisoners murdered in German captivity represent not just historical tragedy, but permanent warning about the human cost when nations abandon fundamental principles of human dignity, when military forces reject constraints of international law, and when bureaucratic systems are employed to execute genocidal policies with administrative efficiency. That is the terrible legacy of the forgotten Holocaust, carved not in memorial stone but in the transformed understanding that prisoner abuse constitutes war crime, that following orders provides no moral or legal defense, that differential treatment based on nationality or ideology reveals genocidal intent, and that systematic starvation is murder regardless of bureaucratic language used to disguise it. The evidence survived. The victims are remembered. The crime stands proven, and the warning endures. Civilized society rests on respecting human dignity, even toward enemies, protecting prisoners, even during war, and maintaining moral constraints, even when ideology or military advantage suggests otherwise. Nazi Germany violated these principles comprehensively, murdering 3 million Soviet prisoners through bureaucratic genocide. The lesson written in their deaths must never be forgotten.